So we're getting quite far along here. The next thing I'm going to do after basting this upper portion of the yokes is to French seam the side seams. And if you're not familiar with French seams or you need a little refresher on that, I do have a YouTube video on how to make tiny French seams, and I will put a link to that below. I basted together at the sleeve cap here on the facing part of the yoke portion, and I've finished my side seam, so it's really coming together now and starting to look like a dress. So now we are up to the sleeves, and I wanted to talk about that for a minute. You're going to cut your sleeves out and also cut out your sleeve band. You want to cut this as a parallelogram, and because I'm using gingham, it's real easy to see, but these are 45-degree angles. So you'll use your pattern piece and cut out your sleeve band, and to sew them together it always looks weird because you're going to put them together like this, so it looks real odd, and then you're going to stitch your 1/4 inch seam allowance and press it open, and this will be your finished sleeve band. Then the next thing is gathering stitches, and you want to place marks at the areas indicated on your pattern piece: the double notch for the back, your shoulder seam, the front, and then the 2 notches at the bottom of the sleeve, and run gathering stitches there. And a lot of people don't realize this, and I didn't for a long time. When I was a new seamstress, I used to just set my sewing machine to the longest stitch possible and would run the gathering stitches. Now, I don't do that anymore. You need to determine your stitch length for gathering based on your fabric. And the lighter weight your fabric is, the shorter your stitch length can be for gathering. So if I'm working with a Swiss batiste, my stitch length for gathering would be a 2.5. This is a soft, lightweight brushed cotton. It's softer than a broadcloth, so I have used a 3.5 stitch length to gather. And I don't know that you can see it. I've got 2 rows of gathering stitches at the bottom of the sleeve. I did one at 1/8 of an inch and one just a little past 1/4 of an inch. So one will be inside the seam allowance and the other will be outside the seam allowance. For the sleeve cap, I've run 3 rows of gathering stitches. One at a generous 1/8 of an inch, and then I moved, a little bit away each time. The outside one will be outside the 3/8 inch seam allowance. This one is hopefully just inside the 3/8 inch seam allowance, and this is inside the seam allowance. If you prefer, you can just do 2 rows, but you really will get very pretty results with 3 rows. And I did run the gathering stitches from notch to notch, but I probably will not put a lot of gathers closer to the notches. Will end up being approximately at the seam where the yoke joins to the skirt in the front and the back. But this is not a very puffy sleeve, and I want to keep more of the gathers towards the sleeve cap. And I know that there are some people that prefer to sew their, you can't do this with a parallelogram, but they prefer to sew their bottom sleeve band on flat, and you would do that with a straight edge here. It's just prettier if you do it separately. So, if you find that too difficult and you prefer to do it flat, then you'll need to cut your bias bands with straight ends. So if it's 10 inches, it would be 10 inches with squared off ends, and you can attach the bias to the bottom. But when you do it in the round like this, the nice part about that, it's really hard to see, is on the bias. Then when you start turning your seam allowances in, you've distributed the bulk of the seam allowance in different areas, whereas if you sew it flat to the bottom of the sleeve, you've got a lot of bulk at that underarm seam. It all comes in the same place. So the easiest way to do this is to turn the sleeve inside out and put the sleeve band right sides together to the bottom of the sleeve band. And I try to match up at about 1/4 of an inch. I try to match where the seam for the bias band and the seam for the seam allowance underneath the arm are in the same place. And I'll put a pin there. And then I'll pin where the gathers will begin. On each side. You do end up with a lot of strings here. And if you want, you can also fold it in half so that the center of each is centered there. And again, this is not a real full sleeve, so more of the gathers will be towards the center of the sleeve than towards the underarm, because that will be prettier. And then you just gently pull on your gathering threads and distribute your gathers on the sleeve. And do that on each side. And once it's pinned on, to sew this, the easiest way is to sew it with the sleeve band up and the gathers down, because that way you can sew a couple inches and then readjust and sew a couple inches and then readjust, and it's easier to get around the circle that way. The sleeve band is on, and I've removed the gathering threads that were above the seam line there. And now it's a matter of turning the cut edge in and turning again to get a finished biased edge. You want to make sure that you've got this completely stuffed. If you don't, you're going to have ripples in your bias band, and that is never an attractive look. So the sleeve is set in, and I've removed any of the gathering stitches that were showing on the outside of the sleeve, and I think that is just as sweet as it can be. So I'll need to put the other sleeve in, and then the last step with the sleeves is to finish the seam allowance on the inside, because you don't want to leave it raw. There's several options for this. You can serge it if you have a serger, and that will trim off some of the bulk as well as finish the seam allowance. If you don't have a serger, you can trim your seam allowance about in half and use an overcast stitch on your sewing machine, or you can even just zigzag the two seams together to finish it that way. Or you can get very fancy and use some sort of binding. You could wrap seams grate around the seam allowance and zigzag that around, or even do something as pretty as a bias band finished on the inside. So I'll leave that to you to decide how you want to finish off your sleeves, but we are almost finished at this point. The last things we need to do to complete this dress is to sew the buttons and the buttonholes on the back. And as you can see, I have my buttonholes on the left side and then the buttons on the right side as it faces you. That is my personal preference. It's how I learned to do this when I took pattern drafting classes in college. I know a lot of heirloom sewers prefer to have them go the opposite way, so the buttonholes would be on the right side and the buttons on the left. That is personal preference. As far as I'm concerned, there's not a right and a wrong. It's just literally personal preference. So you can do whichever way you choose to do that. So get your buttons and buttonholes done, and then we have our hem to finish. For the contrast band hem, you will follow the instructions on page 9. I have done, and this is the little tuck. I've got the spaghetti bias on top of it, and the inside is completely finished, as you can see. So that's a nice clean finish. You can't lengthen this dress, so you need to make sure you've got the right length before you cut your pattern pieces out. So I'm doing a little miniature example of this so that you can see it. Obviously, your skirt would be in the round, as would the contrast band. Mine is just a little flat mini sample of this because apparently I forgot to include that when I was initially filming this. So you're going to take your contrast band and fold it in half with the wrong sides together and give it a good press. Then you're going to put it right sides together with the dress. So this would be the dress, the skirt front, and you would be stitching your band with the right sides together. Okay. Once that's complete, you want to press the seam allowance towards the skirt, and then you want to press the band and the amount of your tuck to the inside of the skirt. So this is the wrong side of the skirt and the right side here. You would then stitch right along this seam allowance here, like a stitch in the ditch. And once that's completed, let me just pin this. Once you've got that completed, then your hem is finished. So you would stitch all the way around like this, and then this is again the right side. You're going to press the tuck down, and all you would have here is your stitching line and a tuck. So you could leave it just like that if that's what you prefer to do. I liked to add the little contrast spaghetti bias just to cover up that stitching line. So you can see that everything is encased. You haven't had to do anything by hand, and it's a nice design feature for a dress like this, and it kind of pulls together the collars, the cuffs, everything. So that is the hem finish for the contrast hem. If you are doing the dress with the running stitch hem, you would follow those instructions, and so you would press up your it looks like I've got about a 1/2 inch in here, but whatever your preferred amount, to the inside, and then press up the hem so that there's obviously no raw edge there. And then I lengthen my stitch length to anywhere from a 4 to a 5. You have to kind of decide what stitch length you want. And if you put a thicker, heavier needle in your sewing machine, if you're working with natural fabrics, it's going to create a large hole, and that's very beneficial because then you can go back with your floss and the needle and do your running stitch. And if you can see this, you go in and out of those same holes as the needle punched when it was stitching this, machine stitching the hem in. That's a nice way to get perfectly even running stitches. And just another tip, if you don't like to see the machine stitching threads, you could always use invisible thread to secure the hem initially, and then do your running stitch. And if you were to do that, then once you soak the garment to remove the blue marks and everything else, then those threads would disappear because it's well, not invisible, but it would be a water-soluble thread. So if you used a water-soluble thread, those threads will then disappear afterwards. So that is the second hem finish that you have an option for. And obviously, if you just want to put in a regular hem, you can do that too. But I always like to think that these little extra details add a lot to a garment. So this finishes the fourth sew along. I will be doing one more sew along where we're going to cover an alternate method of putting the placket in and cover a few other little details. That will be coming next. If you enjoyed this video and wish to not miss any upcoming ones, please hit the subscribe button below.